The summer of 1943 marked a decisive turning point on the Eastern Front. The failure of Operation Citadel in July, followed by the Soviet counteroffensives at Orel and Belgorod-Kharkov, left the German Wehrmacht on the defensive. Army Group Center and Army Group South had suffered immense losses in armor and manpower. German records indicate that during July-August 1943, they lost over 1,500 tanks and assault guns, and nearly 300,000 men killed, wounded, or missing. For the Red Army, the victories came at equally high cost. Soviet estimates point to more than 860,000 casualties in the Kursk operations, but the overall balance of initiative had shifted irreversibly. Against this backdrop, the Soviet Stavka formulated the next stage of operations. Ukraine, with control of Ukraine, meant control of vital resources, grain, manganese, iron ore, and access routes toward the Balkans. For the Germans, holding Ukraine was essential to sustaining the war effort, and Hitler issued repeated orders forbidding withdrawal without his personal authorization. By late August 1943, Soviet forces massed along a broad front stretching from the Desna River near Chernigov in the north to the approaches of Poltava in central Ukraine. The Soviet Central Front, under Konstantin Rokossovsky, and the Voronezh Front, under Nikolai Vatutin, were given primary responsibility for the advance. Together they deployed more than 1.25 million men, supported by nearly 2,400 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 13,000 artillery pieces. The Red Air Force committed around 100 aircraft to provide ground support and interdiction. Opposing them stood German Army Group Center's Second Army, under General Walter Weiss. In total, the German formations in the sector amounted to approximately 600,000 troops, backed by 1,200 operational tanks and assault guns, and around 700 combat aircraft. Although heavily outnumbered, German forces retained experienced cadres and were entrenched along the natural defensive line of the Desna River and fortified towns such as Chernigov, Nizhyn, and Poltava. The political atmosphere in Moscow emphasized urgency. Stalin and the Soviet High Command wanted to exploit the weakened German front before reinforcements could stabilize it. Intelligence reports suggested that the Wehrmacht was regrouping to establish a defensive line along the Dnieper River, the so-called Eastern Wall. If the Soviets delayed, they risked confronting a consolidated German defense across one of the strongest natural barriers in Eastern Europe. Civilian populations in left bank Ukraine had endured 2 years of harsh occupation. German authorities had requisitioned grain, destroyed infrastructure, and deported hundreds of thousands for forced labor. Villages near potential battlefields faced evacuation or devastation. Soviet partisans, numbering over 100,000 in Ukraine by 1943, intensified sabotage missions, cutting railway lines and attacking convoys to support the coming offensive. Their actions disrupted German supply flows and tied down security divisions that could otherwise reinforce the front. Preparations for the offensive required immense logistical coordination. Soviet engineers brought forward pontoon bridges, ferries, and bridging equipment to cross the Desna and later the Dnieper. Railways leading from Bryansk, Kursk, and Voronezh were repaired at record speed to bring ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. The Red Army's doctrine emphasized deep operations, meaning not just to break through the front line, but to push armored formations rapidly into the enemy's rear. Rokossovsky and Vatutin both prepared to unleash tank and cavalry mechanized groups once initial bridgeheads were secured. The Germans, aware of the coming assault, strengthened defensive belts. Along the Desna, they constructed trenches, bunkers, and minefields, relying on the river as a natural obstacle. Mobile reserves, including the 7th and 19th Panzer Divisions, were stationed to counter expected Soviet breakthroughs. However, German intelligence underestimated the scale of the Soviet buildup, believing the Red Army had exhausted itself after Kursk and might pause before attempting another major operation. As August turned to September, tension rose along the front. Reconnaissance flights spotted Soviet concentrations, and partisan attacks intensified. Both sides understood that the battles to come would determine not only control of northern and central Ukraine, but also the tempo. A Soviet success would open the road to the Dnieper and Kyiv, while a German stand could buy precious time to regroup and prolong the war in the east. The stage was thus set for one of the most intense campaigns of 1943. The Chernigov-Poltava operation would test the endurance of both armies, exact enormous costs from soldiers and civilians alike, and fundamentally alter the strategic map of Eastern Europe. In late August 1943, the Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts began their coordinated push toward the Desna River line. The operation opened with extensive artillery barrages, concentrated fire from more than 13,000 guns and mortars, designed to weaken German forward defenses and clear passages for infantry assault. On 26 August, forward detachments of Rokossovsky's Central Front initiated the Chernigov-Pripyat offensive, striking German Second Army positions along a 200-kilometer front. Within 2 days, Vatutin's Voronezh front joined the effort further south, pressing against German 8th Army units deployed on the approaches to Poltava and the central Ukrainian rail network. Initial Soviet advances were costly. German defenders had constructed multiple belts of trenches, machine gun nests, and minefields on the western bank of the Desna. At Chernigov, where the river could reach 200 meters in width, Wehrmacht units used well-prepared strongpoints to channel Soviet infantry into killing zones. Reports from Soviet 13th and 61st Armies note heavy casualties as troops attempted crossings in improvised boats and rafts under artillery and machine gun fire. German rearguards frequently destroyed bridges, forcing Soviet engineers to build pontoons while under bombardment. Nevertheless, the offensive pressed forward. Soviet 2nd Tank Army, commanded by Alexei Rodin, was committed early to exploit gaps north of Nizhyn. Deep raids threatened German supply lines, compelling the Wehrmacht to divert panzer reserves. Luftwaffe units of Luftflotte 6 attempted to disrupt Soviet river crossings with dive bomber attacks, but the Red Air Force committed entire fighter divisions to escort bridging operations. By the end of August, the Soviets had established several bridgeheads, some as deep as 10 kilometers, though each required fierce fighting to hold. The German reaction was coordinated, but hampered by shortages. Army Group Center ordered the 7th Panzer Division and elements of the 20th Panzer Grenadier Division to launch counterattacks against Rokossovsky's bridgeheads. These thrusts temporarily retook ground, but could not destroy the crossings entirely. Meanwhile, further south, Vatutin's formations forced German 167th and 198th Infantry Divisions into withdrawal from key positions along the Sula River. German commanders increasingly relied on delaying tactics, scorched earth demolitions, rapid redeployment of artillery, and limited armored thrusts designed to buy time. Artillery duels defined much of the opening phase. On the northern axis near Novgorod-Seversky, Soviet batteries fired tens of thousands of shells in concentrated bursts, overwhelming local defenses. Civilian settlements in the area were reduced to ruins, their inhabitants fleeing amid both bombardment and German retreat demolitions. By the first week of September, Soviet troops secured Chernigov's outskirts, forcing German units to prepare for urban defense. Further south, toward Poltava, the situation mirrored the Desna battles. Soviet rifle divisions crossed tributaries under cover of smoke screens, often sustaining severe losses before tanks could be ferried across. German 8th Army tried to hold positions anchored on strong points like Romny and Lubny, but the Luftwaffe attempted mass sorties, over 300 missions on some days, but Soviet numerical superiority in aircraft ensured gradual air dominance. Command structures on both sides faced immediate challenges. Rokossovsky coordinated multiple armies while maintaining constant pressure along the Desna line. Vatutin pressed his generals to accelerate advances despite high casualties, aware that delay would allow Germans to consolidate along the Dnieper. German generals Weiss and Wöhler received repeated directives from Hitler not to abandon key towns without authorization, limiting their flexibility. This led to garrisons being encircled and destroyed rather than withdrawn in time. By early September, the Soviet opening phase had achieved its immediate objectives: bridgeheads on the Desna and penetration into German tactical zones. The cost was immense, with some rifle divisions reduced to half strength within days. German attempts at containment had slowed but not stopped the advance. The stage was set for broader clashes as both sides prepared for the next phase, the struggle for major urban centers and the approaches to the Dnieper River. The planning behind the Chernigov-Poltava offensive reflected both the Soviet ambition for decisive advances and the German determination to hold ground long enough to establish the next defensive line. By August 1943, the Stavka issued explicit directives to Rokossovsky's Central Front and Vatutin's Voronezh Front: break through the Desna defenses, drive German forces out of left bank Ukraine, and secure crossings over the Dnieper before the enemy could prepare a fortified barrier. The operation was intended not only to reclaim occupied territory, but also to prevent the Wehrmacht from stabilizing the front on the Dnieper, which German engineers were already preparing as the Eastern Wall. The strategic objectives were thus clear. For the Soviets, this was a continuation of the summer counteroffensive momentum that began at Orel and Kursk. Stalin demanded rapid advances to show tangible victories to both the Soviet population and the Allies. The capture of major cities, Chernigov, Nizhyn, Poltava, and eventually Kiev, would strengthen Soviet political standing and demonstrate the irreversible decline of German power in the East. Militarily, the offensive aimed to destroy large parts of the German 2nd and 8th Armies, disrupt communications, and force Army Group South into a retreat that might expose its entire position in Ukraine. For the Germans, the goals were more limited, but no less vital. Hitler insisted on delaying actions designed to buy time for the construction of strong defensive lines along the Dnieper and the so-called Panther-Wotan positions. The Wehrmacht could not afford another collapse like at Orel, but the reality of depleted reserves meant that German armies could not defend every sector with equal strength. High Command ordered Commanders Weiss and Wöhler to hold key rail junctions and river crossings, destroy infrastructure during withdrawals, and inflict maximum casualties on Soviet spearheads. The intention was to make the Soviet push costly enough to slow its momentum, preserving German strength for the decisive battles on the Dnieper line. Logistics played a central role in shaping both sides' strategies. The Red Army invested heavily in bridging equipment, ferries, and transport units to overcome the multiple river barriers in Ukraine. By late August, engineer brigades had assembled over 60 heavy pontoon parks and thousands of small boats for infantry crossings. Soviet supply lines ran back through Bryansk and Kursk, where railheads had been repaired after the Kursk battles. Fuel and ammunition were brought forward by truck columns numbering in the thousands. The scale of these preparations demonstrated the emphasis on sustaining a rapid advance despite the devastation of roads and railways left by German retreats. For the Wehrmacht, logistics were increasingly precarious. The retreat from Kursk and Kharkov had cost large quantities of rolling stock and fuel depots. Partisan activity further undermined reliability. In August alone, Ukrainian partisans reported more than 1,500 rail demolitions, halting supply trains for days at a time. German divisions often operated with reduced artillery ammunition, and armored units lacked fuel for continuous maneuver. Reinforcements were slow to arrive. Some divisions transferred from France and the Balkans would not reach the front until September, by which point Soviet advances were already underway. Propaganda accompanied the planning stage. Soviet newspapers announced the imminent liberation of Ukraine, encouraging partisan groups and civilian resistance. Stalin's orders emphasized that the Red Army was fighting not only to expel the invader, but to restore Ukrainian towns and villages to Soviet control. In contrast, German propaganda stressed the heroic stand on the Dnieper line and portrayed Soviet advances as reckless assaults paid for with excessive casualties. Both sides used these narratives to reinforce morale among their troops and populations, though the reality at the front was harsher. Soldiers on both sides braced for relentless combat across rivers, forests, and towns devastated by 2 years of occupation. Intelligence assessments influenced operational decisions. Soviet reconnaissance, aided by partisan reports, identified the locations of German strongpoints and movements of German intelligence, on the other hand, underestimated Soviet reserves. Reports to Army Group South suggested that Soviet losses at Kursk had left the Red Army temporarily weakened, leading some commanders to believe that the next offensive would be localized rather than a full-scale push across northern and central Ukraine. This miscalculation meant German defenses were often prepared for smaller thrusts rather than the massive multi-front operation that unfolded. The overall strategic framework by early September 1943 was one of asymmetry. The Soviets aimed at relentless forward momentum, accepting high casualties to reach the Dnieper before winter. The Germans focused on trading space for time, destroying infrastructure, and holding key junctions long enough to complete their defensive preparations further west. Both sides knew that the coming battles would involve immense sacrifices. The plans on paper now awaited their test in reality, as the first engagements around Chernigov and the approaches to Poltava escalated into full-scale clashes. The first major clashes of the Chernigov-Poltava operation unfolded during the opening weeks of September 1943, as Soviet forces attempted to break through German defenses along the Desna River and expand their bridgeheads into northern and central Ukraine. The fighting quickly escalated into a series of brutal engagements that tested the endurance of both armies. At Chernigov, the German Second Army had organized its defenses into layered belts, making use of the Desna as a natural barrier. Units of the 8th Infantry Division, reinforced by elements of the 7th Panzer Division, held key strongpoints at river crossings and road junctions. Soviet 13th Army and 61st Army led the assault, supported by massed artillery barrages. Soviet infantry crossed in small boats and rafts, often under direct fire, while engineers constructed pontoon bridges to enable the passage of tanks and heavy equipment. Reports indicate that some divisions lost up to one-third of their strength in the first days of the crossing attempts, but bridgeheads were established by 6 to 7 September. The fighting for Nizhyn to the south highlighted the tempo of the Soviet advance. Rokossovsky ordered elements of the 2nd Tank Army to push toward the city once infantry secured the riverbank. German defenders mounted counterattacks using assault guns and armored reserves, temporarily halting progress and inflicting severe losses on exposed Soviet spearheads. Yet the Red Army maintained pressure, rotating fresh rifle units into the battle and continuing to expand its lodgements. By mid-September, Nizhyn was encircled, and German formations faced the choice of costly breakout attempts or destruction in place. The Soviet method of constant artillery saturation, followed by waves of infantry and armored thrusts, gradually overcame German strongpoints, at the cost of heavy casualties on both sides. Civilian populations were caught in the midst of these engagements. Towns along the Desna and Sula rivers suffered under artillery bombardment and aerial attacks from both sides. German forces conducted scorched earth demolitions during withdrawals, destroying bridges, rail stations, and food stores. Soviet sources describe local villagers attempting to ferry Red Army soldiers across rivers in small fishing boats, while German records note the forced evacuation of thousands toward the west to deny manpower to the advancing Soviets. The population endured hunger, bombardment, and reprisals, underscoring the human toll of the rapid shifts in the front line. Further south, near Romny and Lubny, Vatutin's Voronezh front engaged German 167th and 198th. Here, the terrain of rolling plains interspersed with rivers offered little natural protection, and both sides relied on mobility. Soviet rifle divisions advanced behind creeping artillery barrages, followed by tank brigades attempting to outflank German positions. The Wehrmacht countered with rapid redeployments of motorized units, launching counterthrusts that retook villages and temporarily delayed Soviet progress. However, Soviet superiority in numbers gradually told. Entire regiments were committed to assaults designed to exhaust German defenders, and constant reinforcement allowed the offensive to continue despite high losses. The Luftwaffe attempted to intervene decisively during these engagements. Dive bombers targeted Soviet pontoon bridges, destroying several and causing significant delays. On 9 September, for example, German air attacks on the Desna crossings reportedly sank dozens. Yet Soviet air forces responded with concentrated fighter patrols, engaging in large-scale dogfights that increasingly favored the Red Air Force. By mid-September, Soviet ground attack aircraft operated with growing freedom, striking German troop concentrations and road columns retreating toward Poltava. Morale played a central role during these first engagements. Soviet soldiers, buoyed by recent victories at Kursk and the promise of liberating Ukrainian territory, displayed determination even in the face of massive casualties. German troops, though seasoned and disciplined, recognized the scale of Soviet numbers pressing against them. Accounts from German commanders reflect frustration with Hitler's strict orders, forbidding timely withdrawals, which often led to encirclement. Units that might have retreated in good order were instead destroyed or captured, further weakening the overall defensive capacity. Unexpected outcomes also shaped this stage. Soviet cavalry mechanized groups, traditionally considered secondary formations, achieved surprising success in deep raids against German supply lines. In some sectors, these mobile units penetrated 30-40 kilometers behind German front lines, cutting communications and forcing hasty redeployments of armored reserves. Though costly, these raids disrupted German coordination and accelerated the pressure on key strongpoints. By the third week of September, the first phase of the engagements had shifted the balance. Chernigov's defenses were collapsing under sustained assault, Nizhyn was isolated, and German forces were withdrawing toward Poltava and the central Dnieper. Soviet bridgeheads along the Desna had expanded, enabling the passage of entire tank corps and mechanized formations. The cost to the Red Army was immense, rifle divisions reduced to 40% strength, tank brigades losing half their vehicles, but the line was broken. The offensive was no longer a localized push, but a broad advance threatening the entire German position in left bank Ukraine. These early battles marked the transition from probing actions to full-scale breakthroughs. Both sides recognized that the campaign had entered a decisive stage where the outcome would hinge on endurance, reserves, and the ability to adapt to relentless combat across rivers, towns, and open plains. The clashes around Chernigov and Nizhyn set the tone for what would become one of the most intense campaigns of 1943, pushing both armies to the limits of their capacity. The escalation of the Chernigov-Poltava campaign in mid-September 1943 revealed the scale of the crisis for both armies. The initial crossings of the Desna and advances toward Nizhyn and Romny had forced German formations into retreat, but the Wehrmacht was not yet in full flight. Army Group Center and Army Group South attempted to stabilize the line by committing reserves, conducting counterattacks, and using the destruction of infrastructure as a means to delay the Soviet advance. For the Red Army, the challenge was sustaining momentum across vast distances while overcoming successive defensive positions, each backed by artillery, armor, and air support. The fighting expanded rapidly. Rokossovsky's central front pressed south and west toward Chernigov, while Vatutin's Voronezh front drove hard on Poltava, threatening to cut the German Eighth Army off from its supply bases. New fronts opened as Soviet formations advanced simultaneously along multiple axes, toward Pripyat marshes in the north, across the Sula Basin in the center, and into the steppe approaches leading to Poltava in the south. By mid-September, the active front in Ukraine stretched nearly 400 kilometers, placing enormous strain on German reinforcements were limited but crucial. The 7th and 19th Panzer Divisions, along with elements of the Grossdeutschland Division, were redeployed to counter Soviet thrusts. These mobile reserves executed sharp counterblows, retaking villages and temporarily halting Soviet spearheads. At Lubny, a German armored counterattack destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks in a single day, forcing the Red Army to pause for regrouping. Yet these tactical successes could not alter the strategic balance. The Panzer divisions lacked fuel and replacements, their armored strength falling to below 50% of authorized strength by late September. The terrain added further challenges. Northern sectors were marked by dense forests and marshes near the Desna and Pripyat, complicating supply movements and limiting tank mobility. Central Ukraine's rivers, Sula, Sayol, and Vorskla, created successive natural barriers that required repeated engineering efforts. Each crossing demanded the construction of pontoon bridges under fire, while German artillery targeted ferries and roads. In the south, the open steppe allowed rapid advances, but exposed Soviet columns to Luftwaffe strikes. The constant need to adapt to terrain slowed the tempo, but Soviet commanders pressed forward regardless of losses, knowing that delay favored the defenders. Casualties mounted heavily during this phase. German records indicate that by the third week of September, Army Group South had suffered nearly 120,000 casualties in Ukraine since August. Soviet figures were even higher. Some rifle divisions reported losses of over half their men within 2 weeks of combat. Entire regiments were reduced to battalion strength, with replacements rushed forward from reserve armies. Medical services on both sides struggled under the burden, with field hospitals overwhelmed and evacuation routes disrupted by constant fighting. Political pressure exacerbated the crisis. Hitler issued repeated orders forbidding the abandonment of major towns without his personal approval. This resulted in the garrison of Chernigov being held until 21st September, when Soviet assaults finally forced its fall after encirclement. Similar instructions delayed withdrawals from Romny and Poltava, costing German divisions irreplaceable manpower. For Soviet commanders, Stalin demanded speed and visible victories. Stavka directives emphasized rapid exploitation once towns were taken, even at the expense of high casualties. This political imperative ensured that the offensive maintained pressure despite exhaustion. Air power became increasingly decisive. The Luftwaffe, though depleted, concentrated sorties against Soviet crossings and columns. On 15 September, German bombers struck Soviet bridging equipment near Novgorod-Seversky, destroying several pontoons and sinking ammunition barges. Soviet reports noted delays of up to 48 hours. At the same time, the Red Air Force committed entire air armies to support the offensive. Il-2 ground attack aircraft flew hundreds of sorties daily, targeting German artillery and troop concentrations. The battle for the skies remained contested, but Soviet numerical superiority ensured gradual attrition of German air strength. Civilian suffering grew worse with escalation. German forces applied scorched earth tactics during withdrawals, burning villages, deporting laborers, and destroying food stocks. Thousands of civilians were forced westward, while others fled into forests to escape reprisals. Soviet troops often entered devastated towns devoid of supplies, creating logistical strain as the Red Army had to share rations with liberated populations. In some areas, partisan units coordinated with advancing armies, attacking German columns and railways, further increasing the chaos of retreat. By the end of September, Soviet spearheads were within reach of Poltava, one of the major regional centers, while bridgeheads along the Desna had expanded sufficiently to allow the passage of entire tank armies. German counterattacks inflicted heavy losses, but could not prevent the steady erosion of their front. The crisis was no longer confined to individual sectors. Army Group South faced the collapse of its entire defensive position in left bank Ukraine. The escalation phase thus revealed the limits of German endurance and the relentless character of the Soviet advance. Every kilometer gained required costly river crossings, urban assaults, and continuous fighting, but the Red Army refused to pause. Both sides bled heavily, but the strategic outcome was becoming clear. The Germans could delay, but they could not stop the Soviet thrust toward the Dnieper and the heart of Ukraine. The campaign reached its peak in the second half of September 1943, when the struggle for major urban centers and the crossings to the central Dnieper line unfolded in full force. The battles for Chernigov and Poltava, as well as the drive toward Kremenchuk and Kremenchuk's crossing points, epitomize the intensity of this stage. Soviet armies committed their heaviest artillery and mechanized formations, while the Germans concentrated their remaining mobile divisions in desperate counterattacks. The result was some of the fiercest urban and river fighting of the year. The battle for Chernigov illustrates the pattern of combat. German Second Army units, primarily the 8th Infantry Division and supporting regiments, resisted with entrenched positions inside the city. For 5 days, Soviet 61st Army fought block by block, employing massed artillery bombardments that reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Soviet artillery fired tens of thousands of shells into German lines, followed by infantry assaults that gradually tightened the encirclement. Luftwaffe squadrons flew hundreds of sorties in attempts to break the siege, while Soviet fighters and ground attack aircraft intercepted and struck German columns retreating west. On 23 September, Poltava was liberated, its defenders either retreating in disarray or captured. The fall of Poltava marked a critical breakthrough, collapsing German hopes of holding the central left bank sector. Meanwhile, the drive toward Kremenchuk and the Dnieper crossings escalated into massive engagements. Soviet formations sought to secure bridgeheads over the Great River before German defenses could fully establish. Rokossovsky and Vatutin both committed tank armies and cavalry mechanized groups to exploit breakthroughs. The Germans, in turn, concentrated their last effective armored reserves, including Grossdeutschland Division and the 19th Panzer Division, to counter these thrusts. Battles near Kremenchuk featured large-scale tank engagements in open steppe terrain, with hundreds of tanks engaged on both sides. Reports suggest Soviet tank brigades lost up to half their vehicles in a matter of days, yet continued to push forward under relentless orders. German armor inflicted tactical defeats, but could not prevent Soviet forces from establishing bridgeheads. Artillery and air bombardments reached their highest intensity. Soviet artillery groupings massed entire corps-level concentrations, firing sustained barrages that consumed thousands of shells per hour. German defenders noted entire front sectors turned into fire zones where movement became impossible. Luftwaffe units operating from airfields further west attempted to disrupt. By late September, the Red Air Force launched more than 2,000 sorties daily across the Ukrainian front, isolating German units and preventing orderly retreats. The civilian cost was catastrophic. German scorched earth orders meant systematic destruction of bridges, railways, factories, and food stores. In Poltava, retreating troops blew up power plants and warehouses, leaving the population without supplies. Deportations continued as labor columns were marched west under guard. For civilians who remained, bombardments from both sides and street battles brought widespread devastation. Soviet authorities reported tens of thousands homeless and displaced, while German reports acknowledged that infrastructure losses crippled local supply capacity. High command decisions shaped this peak phase. Stalin pressed his commanders to maintain offensive tempo, rejecting proposals for operational pauses. Rokossovsky and Vatutin emphasized deep penetration even when divisions were exhausted, committing fresh reserves from the steppe front under Ivan Konev to sustain pressure. On the German side, Hitler's refusal to authorize timely withdrawals trapped divisions in untenable positions. General Wöhler of 8th Army repeatedly requested permission to retreat behind the Dnieper earlier, but only received authorization after Poltava fell. By then, Soviet forces were already advancing toward the great river crossings. The culmination of these battles demonstrated the irreversible shift in momentum. German formations, though fighting with determination, were bled white. Several infantry divisions reported strengths reduced to fewer than 3,000 combat-effective men. Panzer divisions, after weeks of constant counterattacks, fielded barely 50-70 operational tanks. The Soviets, despite enormous casualties, continued to press forward with overwhelming numbers, replacing losses and rotating units to sustain the advance. By the end of September 1943, the peak of the campaign had been reached. Chernigov and Poltava were liberated, Soviet bridgeheads threatened the Dnieper line, and German forces faced retreat under chaotic conditions. The cost for both sides was staggering in human and material terms, but the Soviet objective was largely achieved. The Wehrmacht was forced from its central Ukrainian strongholds, leaving only the Dnieper as the last natural barrier before Kyiv. As the offensive continued into late September 1943, the character of the fighting shifted toward a phase of resistance and adaptation on both sides. The initial Soviet breakthroughs at Chernigov and Poltava had forced the Wehrmacht into retreat, but German forces did not simply collapse. Instead, they attempted to regroup along successive river lines, conducting counterattacks with armored divisions and employing delaying tactics to slow the Soviet momentum. At the same time, Soviet commanders refined their methods, integrating partisans, adapting crossing techniques, and exploiting weaknesses in German defenses. The German High Command concentrated its remaining mobile forces to blunt the Soviet advance. The Grossdeutschland Division, one of the most powerful formations in the East, was redeployed to support Army Group South. Alongside it, elements of the 19th Panzer Division and the 7th Panzer Division conducted repeated counterattacks against Soviet spearheads. These operations inflicted heavy casualties. In several engagements near the Sayal River, Soviet tank brigades lost dozens of vehicles to concentrated German fire. Yet the cost for the Germans was equally severe. Fuel shortages restricted operational reach, while constant Soviet artillery barrages limited the freedom of maneuver. By the end of September, most German panzer units were shadows of their former strength, fielding fewer than 80 operational tanks each. Soviet commanders anticipated German resistance and responded with relentless pressure. Rokossovsky ordered the commitment of additional mechanized corps to exploit bridgeheads across the Desna. Vatutin emphasized continuous assaults on German defensive lines near the Vorskla and Sayal rivers, employing not only massed rifle divisions but also cavalry mechanized groups capable of deep raids. These mobile formations, supported by tank brigades, penetrated up to 30 kilometers behind German lines, severing rail links and forcing German staff to divert precious reserves to plug gaps. Such raids, though costly, undermined the cohesion of German defenses and disrupted their ability to stage counterattacks. Partisan warfare reached a new level of coordination. Ukrainian partisan units, numbering over 100,000 fighters across the region, launched attacks on German supply convoys, railways, and communication centers. During September alone, they claimed the destruction of hundreds of rail cars and dozens of locomotives. In many cases, partisan operations were timed to coincide with Soviet offensives, forcing German security battalions to divide their attention. Reports from Army Group South complained that rear areas were no longer secure, making it nearly impossible to guarantee steady resupply of frontline divisions. This erosion of the logistical backbone accelerated German losses. The Soviets also adapted their methods. Learning from these setbacks, engineer units employed new tactics, crossing at night under cover of smoke screens, dispersing bridges to reduce vulnerability, and constructing underwater fords in shallow sections. In several sectors, they used local civilian boats to supplement military bridging equipment. These adaptations allowed the rapid transfer of reinforcements across the Desna and Vorskla, keeping the momentum of the offensive intact. Psychological strain affected both sides. Soviet soldiers endured immense casualties but were driven by the prospect of liberating Ukrainian territory and by constant reinforcement from reserve armies. Morale was bolstered by propaganda emphasizing the liberation of towns and villages. German troops, in contrast, faced declining confidence. Hitler's rigid orders to hold ground led to encirclements and preventable losses, and many units felt abandoned by higher command. Diaries from German officers describe a sense of inevitability, that each counterattack was temporary, and the Soviet tide could not be reversed. Still, discipline held, and German units continued to mount fierce resistance, inflicting severe casualties even as they retreated. Civilian involvement shaped the adaptation phase. In liberated areas, villagers provided intelligence on German positions, guided Soviet troops through terrain, and sometimes joined partisan units. German forces, meanwhile, intensified reprisals, burning villages suspected of aiding the Red Army. This cycle of cooperation and retaliation deepened the hardships of the local population, but it also further weakened German authority in occupied regions. By late September, Soviet bridgeheads across key rivers were firmly established, and mechanized groups pressed closer to the Dnieper. German defenses remained formidable in places, but their ability to resist was deteriorating. The adaptation on both sides had determined the pace of the campaign, the Soviets learning to sustain relentless advances despite obstacles, and the Germans fighting with dwindling reserves, relying on counterattacks that could no longer alter the strategic picture. The stage was set for the decisive turning point, the battles that would carry the Red Army across the Dnieper and mark the collapse of German control over much of left bank Ukraine. The turning point of the Chernigov-Poltava campaign arrived in the final days of September 1943, when the Red Army captured key urban centers and secured bridgeheads across the Dnieper. These victories marked the moment at which German defenses in left bank Ukraine ceased to function as a coherent front and shifted into a series of improvised withdrawals. The liberation of Chernigov on 21 September and Poltava on 23 September were the visible symbols of this transition, but the decisive factor lay in the Soviet establishment of crossings over the Dnieper itself, which the Germans had hoped to turn into an impregnable barrier. The fall of Chernigov was particularly significant. After days of encirclement and street fighting, Soviet 61st Army forced the German garrison into retreat or surrender. The loss of this city deprived the Wehrmacht of one of its key northern strongpoints and opened the road to Gomel and the central Dnieper line. For the Germans, the defeat demonstrated the failure of Hitler's orders to hold urban centers at all costs. Units trapped inside Chernigov were destroyed, reducing the 8th Infantry Division to a fraction of its strength. For Soviet troops, the victory boosted morale. As a vital rail hub connecting Kharkov, Kremenchuk, and Kyiv, the city's loss fractured German logistical networks. Vatutin's Voronezh front, employing elements of the 4th Guards Army and supporting tank corps, executed a rapid encirclement that forced German defenders into chaotic withdrawal. Despite Luftwaffe efforts to supply and reinforce the city, Soviet artillery and air interdiction prevented any effective relief. The fall of Poltava signaled that the Soviet offensive had not only seized ground, but dismantled the German system of communications in central Ukraine. By this time, Soviet forces pressed toward the Dnieper with remarkable speed. Rokossovsky's Central Front advanced southwest, securing crossings near Loyu and south of Gomel, while Vatutin's Voronezh Front moved on Kremenchuk. The Steppe Front under Konev, brought into the operation to reinforce the southern axis, surged westward, threatening. The combined advance stretched German command structures beyond endurance. Army Group South was forced to concede that holding the left bank was no longer possible. The Dnieper itself represented the last natural line of defense east of Kyiv. German engineers had been preparing the so-called Eastern Wall since the summer, constructing bunkers, trenches, and obstacles along the western bank. Yet the speed of the Soviet advance prevented these defenses from being fully completed. Soviet spearheads reached the river in multiple places before German units could organize cohesive resistance. At Kremenchuk, Soviet troops seized partial bridgeheads despite fierce opposition. Engineer units ferried infantry across at night using boats and rafts, while German artillery shelled the crossings without pause. By 28 September, small but significant lodgements existed on the 19th Panzer Division and Grossdeutschland Division launched counterattacks against Soviet bridgeheads, inflicting heavy losses but unable to dislodge entrenched infantry once they established footholds. Fuel shortages crippled mobility, and Soviet artillery blanketed German assembly areas, preventing large-scale offensive maneuvers. Luftwaffe squadrons attempted concentrated strikes, but Soviet fighter patrols increasingly controlled the skies. Losses of experienced pilots during the summer meant that German air support was a fraction of its former strength. Civilian populations witnessed both liberation and destruction during this turning point. In cities like Poltava, Soviet soldiers entered ruined streets where food stocks had been burned and public buildings demolished by retreating German troops. Thousands of civilians emerged from hiding, many malnourished after years of occupation. Simultaneously, other towns were subjected to reprisals as Germans withdrew, with villages burned to prevent them from serving as supply bases for the advancing Red Army. The humanitarian crisis deepened as tens of thousands were left homeless, dependent on improvised Soviet supply efforts. The psychological impact of these events was decisive. Soviet troops, buoyed by rapid advances and the capture of major cities, saw proof of their ability to drive the Germans out of Ukraine. German morale, however, declined sharply. Reports from Army Group South headquarters described divisions reduced to Kampfgruppen and commanders struggling to maintain cohesion. The sense of retreat without end permeated both soldiers and civilians aligned with German forces. Even among officers, confidence in Hitler's directives eroded as repeated stand-fast orders ended in encirclement and destruction. By the close of September 1943, the turning point was complete. The Soviet Union had regained vast swathes of left bank Ukraine, secured bridgeheads across the Dnieper, and shattered German defensive coherence. Though the battles ahead would be equally brutal, particularly the campaign for Kiev, the strategic initiative had irrevocably shifted. The Germans no longer controlled the tempo of operations. The Chernigov-Poltava offensive ensured that the Dnieper, once envisioned as a secure frontier for the Wehrmacht, was instead transformed into the next battleground of Soviet advance. The aftermath of the Chernigov-Poltava campaign unfolded in October 1943, as German forces carried out a hasty withdrawal from left bank Ukraine toward the Dnieper line. What remained of Army Group South's formations attempted to stabilize defenses along the Great River, but the retreat was marked by chaos, devastation, and a humanitarian disaster for the civilian population caught in the middle. For the Soviets, the immediate priority was to consolidate bridgeheads across the Dnieper and prepare for the next phase, the liberation of Kyiv. German withdrawals were characterized by destruction. Following Hitler's scorched earth directives, retreating units demolished bridges, railways, factories, and grain silos. At Poltava and Kremenchuk, warehouses filled with food were set ablaze, leaving civilians without provisions. Rail junctions were systematically destroyed to delay Soviet logistical buildup. Retreating engineers mined roads and bridges, while demolition squads destroyed power plants and water facilities. German records confirmed that entire villages were evacuated or burned to prevent them from supporting the Red Army. This policy created desolation across wide areas, leaving both civilians and advancing Soviet troops to cope with shortages. For the Wehrmacht, the withdrawal was not an orderly regrouping, but a forced retreat under pressure. Divisions already weakened by weeks of combat now moved west in fragmented formations. Infantry units often marched without sufficient transport, abandoning artillery and heavy equipment due to lack of fuel. Some regiments reported losing contact with higher command entirely, functioning only as small Kampfgruppen. The panzer divisions, once the backbone of German counterattacks, had dwindled to a few dozen operational tanks each. Despite these limitations, German rearguards fought stubborn delaying actions, using natural obstacles and fortified towns to buy time for the main force to reach the Dnieper. For the Soviets, pursuit was relentless but costly. Rokossovsky, Vatutin, and Konev all put. These efforts succeeded in capturing stragglers and forcing hurried retreats, but high casualties continued. Many Soviet divisions advancing in October had already been reduced to half strength, yet they were ordered to press on to prevent the Germans from entrenching on the western bank of the Dnieper. The humanitarian crisis deepened dramatically during this phase. Civilians in retreating zones were subject to deportations, as German authorities forced tens of thousands westward for labor. Villages suspected of aiding partisans were destroyed, and reprisals claimed countless lives. Soviet sources describe entire communities burned to the ground, with only ruins left for returning residents. When the Red Army entered liberated towns, they often found populations malnourished, sheltering in cellars, and deprived of basic supplies. The advancing Soviet forces had to allocate rations and organize emergency relief, further straining their own logistical systems. The battles along the river crossings intensified the devastation. At Kremenchuk, Soviet attempts to establish a bridgehead led to days of fighting under constant shelling. Civilians were trapped in the crossfire, with bombardments destroying homes and killing non-combatants. German artillery targeted ferries carrying both soldiers and displaced persons, while Soviet counter-battery fire struck villages used as German firing positions. The result was heavy civilian casualties in addition to military losses. The immediate military consequences for the Germans were severe. Army Group South lost not only vast tracts of territory, but also tens of thousands of men. Estimates suggest that between late August and early October, German forces in Ukraine suffered over 300,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing. The Soviets, though victorious, endured even higher losses. Soviet reports indicate over 400,000 casualties during the Chernigov-Poltava and related Dnieper operations. The scale of destruction left entire regions depopulated or in ruins. As the Germans withdrew, discipline often broke down. Looting and forced requisitioning became widespread, further alienating the civilian population. Retreating units abandoned prisoners of war, destroyed hospitals, and left the wounded behind in makeshift shelters. For Soviet troops entering these areas, evidence of German scorched earth tactics reinforced propaganda narratives of liberation and vengeance. Yet for the civilians, liberation meant survival amid rubble and uncertainty. By mid-October, Soviet bridgeheads had been established along a broad front from Loyu in the north to Kremenchuk in the south. Though none were yet secure enough for large-scale operations, their mere existence undermined German claims that the Dnieper would serve as an impenetrable eastern wall. The Wehrmacht's withdrawal had saved portions of its forces from encirclement, but at enormous cost in material, morale, and strategic position. The campaign's immediate consequences were thus twofold. The Red Army had secured a decisive advance, while the German army had suffered a devastating setback that it could not easily recover from. The aftermath of the Chernigov-Poltava push left Ukraine scarred, but liberated from 2 years of German occupation. It also set the stage for the next, even more decisive confrontation, the battle for Kiev. Before that battle began, both armies faced the daunting task of regrouping. The Soviets to consolidate their bridgeheads and bring up supplies, the Germans to rebuild shattered divisions and attempt to hold a river line that was already compromised. The devastation of September 1943 had created conditions that would shape the rest of the war in Ukraine. The Chernigov-Poltava operation left a profound legacy in both military and historical terms. Strategically, it represented the collapse of German defensive hopes in left bank Ukraine and demonstrated the Soviet Union's ability to sustain large-scale offensives after the turning point of Kursk. The liberation of major cities such as Chernigov and Poltava coupled with the establishment of bridgeheads across the Dnieper, changed the strategic balance of the Eastern Front. For the first time since 1941, German forces were forced into a general retreat across a natural barrier they had counted on for stability. The long-term military consequences were significant. The German army lost its grip on Ukraine's resource base. With the loss of left bank territories, the Wehrmacht was cut off from critical supplies of grain, livestock, manganese, and coal. Although some extraction continued in western Ukraine, the logistical burden on the Reich increased dramatically. At the same time, the Soviet Union regained fertile agricultural land, which improved food supplies for both civilians and the Red Army. The campaign also allowed the Soviets to deploy their forces deeper into central Ukraine, setting the stage for the liberation of Kiev in November 1943 and subsequent advances toward right bank Ukraine and the Balkans. Militarily, the offensive demonstrated the maturity of Soviet operational art. The Red Army coordinated multiple fronts, Central, Voronezh, and Steppe, over a broad axis, employed massed artillery and air support effectively, and integrated partisan activity into strategic planning. Although costly, with over 400,000 casualties, the offensive highlighted the Soviets' capacity to maintain momentum through successive river barriers and urban centers. German defenses, while formidable in localized battles, could no longer withstand the scale and depth of Soviet operations. The Wehrmacht's reliance on rigid orders from Hitler further weakened its adaptability, resulting in the destruction of divisions that might otherwise have been preserved. The German side also drew lasting lessons from the campaign. The failure of the Eastern Wall concept revealed the limitations of relying solely on natural barriers without sufficient reserves and mobility. Army Group South's losses, estimated at 300,000 men in killed, wounded, and missing, eroded its combat effectiveness permanently. Panzer divisions reduced to a fraction of their strength could not be rebuilt quickly, while infantry divisions relied increasingly on inexperienced recruits and foreign auxiliaries. The cumulative effect was the steady erosion of Germany's ability to contest the initiative on the Eastern Front. Politically and culturally, the campaign carried symbolic weight. In the Soviet Union, the liberation of Ukrainian cities was celebrated as a milestone in the Great Patriotic War. Newspapers, films, and radio broadcasts emphasized the heroism of soldiers and partisans, linking their sacrifices to the restoration of Soviet control over key territories. In Ukraine itself, the end of German occupation was both a moment of relief and the beginning of reconstruction under Soviet rule. Many civilians returned to ruins, faced famine conditions, or mourned deported relatives. Yet the narrative of liberation overshadowed these hardships in official commemoration. Internationally, the campaign strengthened the Soviet Union's position among the Allies. The timing coincided with discussions about opening a second front in Europe, and the Red Army's advance underscored its growing role as the dominant military force on the continent. Reports of German losses and Soviet victories circulated widely, reinforcing the perception that the balance of the war had shifted decisively. Historians continue to debate whether the Chernigov-Poltava operation was the most brutal Soviet push of 1943. On one hand, the casualty figures and the scale of destruction support such a characterization. Combined losses exceeded 700,000 men, entire cities were devastated, and civilian suffering was immense. On the other hand, compared to later battles on the Dnieper and at Kiev, or to operations in Belarus in 1944, the campaign was one stage in a broader sequence of offensives. Still, its intensity and cost placed it among the most punishing operations of the war. The memory of the campaign endures in both Ukraine and Russia. In Soviet historiography, it was portrayed as a triumph of unity and sacrifice. Monuments in Chernigov, Poltava, and other cities commemorate the battles, often emphasizing the role of partisans and the heroism of Red Army units. In contemporary Ukrainian memory, the campaign is remembered both as liberation from German occupation and as part of the wider tragedy of war that left vast destruction in its wake. In the final analysis, the Chernigov-Poltava offensive reshaped the course of the Eastern Front. It deprived Germany of a critical defensive position, restored vital territory to the Soviet Union, and confirmed that the Red Army had seized the strategic initiative for the remainder of the war. The operation's legacy lies not only in its immediate military outcomes, but also in the enduring memory of its cost. Tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians lost in a campaign that opened the path to Kiev and foreshadowed the eventual liberation of all Ukraine.